Hey guys, so I wanted to provide some additional Branded Despia tips slash some illegal plays that you do have to be aware of. And so I think even if you don't play Branded Despia, I'm hoping that this video will still be helpful because hey, you get to kind of find out, what happens when you hand trap the deck at certain time periods. And for those of you that do play Branded Despia, I'm hoping this video will actually serve as kind of like a shared space where we can sort of bounce back ideas and certainly, help each other learn, because I certainly have a lot more to learn with this deck. So anyways, let's just get right into it. Alright, so for the first couple of examples, we're going to go through scenarios where we can potentially play through Nibiru and still gimmick lock our opponent. And so, of course, we're going to start with the, let's say with this hand, you had access to both Cartesia and also the Aluber for the Branded Fusion. So we're, of course, going to fire off with the Fusion deployment first, revealing that Granule, and you're going to be able to summon something like the Cartesia. That way, we are a little bit protected through an Imperm, and so we're going to normal summon that Aluber, and we're going to search ourselves Branded Fusion, and then we're going to just activate that Branded Fusion. Let's just say in this scenario, your opponent did not have the Ash. You're going to send the Albaz and the Lubellion in this instance, and you're going to summon something like the Branded Dragon. Now at this point, you're going to go Chainlink 1 Branded Dragon, and then I would actually Chainlink 2 Cartesia here. Now, if your opponent has an Imperm, this is their opportunity to Imperm the Branded Dragon here so that we don't get the fusion effect here. If they do that, that is actually still fine for us in terms of perspective of doing the gimmick lock, because we can still do a gimmick lock if they Imperm this, but we just have to use up the Branded Red. Anyways, for the purpose of this video, let's say they don't have an Imperm, and instead this Cartesia Chainlink 2 will go through, and we will summon that Granule, and then now this will resolve, and we're gonna banish rather that Cartesia that we just fused with, and we're going to also send the Albaz, or rather I should say banish, I don't know why I keep saying that, and then we're going to summon something like the Sanctifier Dragon. And then on a new chain, Granule will also dump, and we're going to summon, or rather dump, that Gimmick Puppet. Now, one thing I do want to mention here is that I have started to make a habit of summoning things in defense mode, especially the Sanctifier. The reason for that is because if your opponent has any kind of like monster they can tribute summon with, especially in this format where Bystials, they're playing a lot, and that's level 6, and also let's say even like against a Chimera deck, they can like tribute summon for Baphomet, add 2 as well. And if they can tribute summon over the Gimmick Puppet and then crash into your Sanctifier if it's an attack mode and then hit you with an evenly matched, that is like really devastating. So I'm not going to give them that opportunity. Realistically, if they cannot special summon, they're not going to be able to summon a monster like off one tribute that will beat over Sanctifier for the most part in most scenarios. Also, in rare instances, if you also have Mirror J plus Sanctify and you have them in attack mode, and you gimmick lock them, but then if you play into like Talents, for example, they'll take one of them and then be able to crash into both of them. So again, while that one's rare, I just want to make sure to be safe. Anyways, in this scenario, you're going to have something like Lubellion come out here now. And at this point, this is where your opponent is going to Nibiru, because they do not want you to get access to Branded Loss through Rebellion, right? So at this point, let's say we do get hit by the Nib here. And we get ourselves a fat Nibiru token here. Now, at this point, your opponent special summon a monster using a monster effect. That is Nibiru. That means Granule can actually trigger here, and you're going to be able to summon something like Quem. Now, before I continue with this effect, just keep in mind, off Granule effect, in this scenario, even if you wanted to summon Lulu Lilith, you actually cannot do that because you are a Fusion Lock, remember that. So, it's not just Branded Fusion that Fusion Locks you, it's actually even like Fusion Deployment as well as Branded Opening, they also Fusion Lock you. So, in that scenario, you can't summon this, so keep that in mind, especially if you're also playing against a Branded Despia player. Anyways, at this point, we're going to use Quem's effect to dump. It technically depends on what you have in your hand. Let's say for this scenario, you have nothing relevant, so we're actually just going to dump a second Cartesia here, because remember the first one is actually banished for the summon of Sanctifier. Now we're gonna actually proceed to end phase in this particular case, so we do have a couple triggers. So we're gonna go with Albion Branded Dragon first, and we're gonna add actually the High Spirits. Normally you would set a Branded in red, and technically it is live because we do have an Aluber, but for this instance, because we're trying to gimmick lock still, we're gonna search the Branded in the High Spirits, and of course the Cartesia will also add back in the end phase. Now in the end phase, still you're gonna actually just fire off that High Spirits that you activated, and with that you're gonna reveal the Cartesia. Now if you play a second Granule, that's great. You can also send that as an option. But in the worst case, you don't, and I'm sure you at least play a Dragoon like I do, you can actually send this as well because it is a spellcaster. It's also a level 8 fusion with 2500 attack, or rather 2500 defense. So at this point, we're going to use High Spirits, send the Dragoon, and the Cartesia, obviously it means that you are giving up on Dragoon for the most part for the rest of the duel, but realistically, if you're gimmick locking your opponent, like you probably don't need it, and you can actually add something like Mercure for the eventual monster negate. Now at this point, a card left the extra deck, so Quem will actually trigger here, and you can actually bring back that Sanctifier that got Nibiru'd earlier in the same turn. So this means now on your opponent's turn, you still have the ability to gimmick lock your opponent and lock them out of special summoning. And so you also even have a Mercurial on top of that for just in case they like top deck a Bystial. And after all that effort, you're going to find out that they were on Flunder all along and you're just going to go cry. Okay, so now let's cover another scenario where you're trying to play through Nibiru and also trying to gimmick lock your opponent. But let's say in this case, you actually already have the Quem in circulation and already used its dump effect. And so now technically, if you have Quem and you just hard drew a Branded Fusion, you can actually do the gimmick lock in 4 summons. Now there are pros and cons to that approach, because the cons are that, you know, you're basically giving up on, you know, like the Albion Branded line, which means you also give up on Branded Loss plus the whatever you can set off Albion. So you're essentially kind of giving up on the explosiveness as well as like the recovery, just to be able to gimmick lock in 4 summons. The pros, of course, is that, you know, if you try to go for that line and then you get Nibiru'd, then you might not really have much play afterwards. Anyways, but let's say in the instance where you actually don't have hard access to the Branded Fusion, but instead you have to rely on something like Branded Opening to get that body on of Aluber and then get the Branded Fusion. In that case, you're actually going to play into Nibiru anyways, because you're going to get to the gimmick lock and it's going to require at least 5 summons. Now in that instance, I was trying to figure out how we can best play around Nibiru, and one way I found is this only works if you also actually have access to a Fallen of Albaz that you can get to grave outside of Branded Fusion. So whether you hard draw the Albaz or let's say even a Shrouded Dragon or even like a Branded Loss will also work. And so definitely I'm not saying this is a line of play that you need to do, but I just want to at least show that it's available, and hopefully we can bounce back ideas on what perhaps a better line of play could be. But now in this example, so let's say we actually, I know a lot of people like to kind of, you know, let's say shotgun this and draw phase. It really depends on the hand. In this case, I would actually go to main phase and summon the Quem first. And the reason for that is because if my opponent has an imperm, I want to at least bait it out through Quem first, because in this particular hand, we really need that Aluber to resolve to get that Branded Fusion. So anyways, let's say they don't have it for this example, and you're going to go Quem, and you're going to dump that Cartesia, and then we would fire off the Branded Opening, and let's just pitch the Albaz in this scenario, and we're going to summon that Albaz, which using its effect, of course, we're going to fetch the Branded Fusion. Next, we're going to use the Branded Fusion, and we're going to dump something like the Albaz and the, let's say, Lubellion to summon the Branded Dragon. At this point, we will go Chainlink 1, Albion Dragon, and then Chainlink to Quem, targeting Cartesia. Now, the kind of like the quote-unquote default way of doing this line of play would be that you actually summon the Cartesia, and then you actually banish the Quem and the Albaz and go into, let's say, something like Sanctifier, and then kind of set up the gimmick lock that way. Again, that can play into Nibiru. It also depends if you play a second Quem or not. A lot of people only play 1. I've actually recently bumped up to 2 because just kind of following the trends of some of the topping lists. Nonetheless, let's just pretend you're only playing 1 here. So at this point, I was actually trying to see whether instead, so let's just say we bring out the Cartesia, and instead of going the Sanctifier right away, we're actually going to go kind of like the kind of regular way, or maybe I shouldn't say regular, but kind of like the old-fashioned way, where we actually go into Lubellion here. And so let's say we summon the Lubellion here, and of course with the effect, we're going to have to pitch a card. Now at this point, I would actually chain, again, to try to play around Nibiru, I would actually chain the Cartesia effect to fuse here. I know what you're thinking. You're probably thinking, why would you do that now? You should just wait until you get Lubellion onto the field, and then get the Lost, and then fuse with Cartesia, so you get that added plus. So let's say we don't chain the Cartesia here, and I'll show you what kind of happens here. So essentially, you know, of course, the Albaz would like, you know, go back. Let's just put it here for now, and then let's say you go into Mirror Jade. So now at this point, and then let's say you bring the Lubellion, and so now of course at this point your opponent would Nibiru you here if they had it. And the problem with not chaining the Cartesia earlier is that if they use Nibiru, and then even if you chain Cartesia, like sure you make the Granule, but it actually just gets tributed right off, and you don't have the opportunity to send off of Granule effect, that gimmick puppet. So that's why let's just reverse back again. So now if we go back to this situation again after the Lubellion effect, and then if you were to chain the Cartesia here and just get rid of that Lubellion, which is going to get shuffled back anyways, and you summon that Granule, and now of course the Lubellion will get shuffled back, and same with the Albaz, and you would bring out the Mirror Jade in this scenario. Now, of course, the new chain of Granule, you're going to dump that gimmick puppet, and then at this point now you're going to do kind of the similar thing, again, bringing that Lubellion here. Now at this point, again, before you get the Branded Lost, your opponent is going to Nibiru you here, and at this point you might as well chain Mirror Jade's effect. In terms of what you send, it kind of depends on what you play in the extra deck. Ideally, you want to do something where you can sell plus off of it. You already have an Albion engraved, so definitely not that. You could send something like, let's say, like the Ash Dragon, or even like a Sprint, or even like technically a Rimbrum. You do have a Fallen of Albaz. Again, with this example, you need to have an extra Albaz for this kind of line of play to work through Nibiru, but realistically, that Albaz is actually going to get banished next turn off Branded Red. So for now, let's just send something. We'll just send Rimbrum here just for the sake of the example where we're not really going to plus off of it. So now let's say the Nibiru is now going to resolve here. So you do unfortunately lose all your guys and you get the fat token here. Now at this point, again, similar line. Granule is now going to trigger as Chainlink 1, and you can now go Mirror Jade Chainlink 2 to nuke the opponent's board, just so you can kind of protect the Granule, but also, you know, your opponent is going to have a 3000 attack body that now will be gone thanks to Mirror Jade, so that's kind of nice. So with Granule, again, if you play a second Quem, that's where it's going to come out, although at the same time, you already used its effect, and so instead, let's just say you have like a Quartus or something, and we just bring that out. So now at this point, we still have a way to gimmick lock our opponent. So now at the, let's say we just go right into end phase. So we're going to use the Albion effect, and we're going to set something like the Branded in Red right here. And of course, we have something like the Cartesia that will come back to our hand. And now at this point, of course, in the end phase still, your opponent's Nibiru will die here. And again, I like to keep emphasizing this line of play only works if you already had a way to get another Albaz into the grave. So now if you know, once your opponent's turn starts, you have the Branded Red, target the Albaz, and with these two, again, if you had a Quem, you can also technically use that as well, but nonetheless, you can now make a Sanctifier on your opponent's turn, and now you can again gimmick lock, even though we got Nibiru, even after using Quem's effect already early in the turn. Now, when it comes to playing around Bystials, unfortunately, it's of course much harder, especially if they have like the one of Magma in their opponent hand. Like if they have Bystials, you're most likely not going to be able to actually gimmick lock them. You do have something like, you know, the Branded in Red play probably still available, again, unless they have Magma Nut. Now, the one time where it does might vary is if you have access to Mercurial, whether you hard druid or you also had Branded Loss early, like you hard druid or something, and you have access to Mercurial on your turn. Let's say your opponent tries to Bystial you on your turn, like let's say before you go into end phase or whatever, and they just want to get rid of either, you know, gimmick or like the Albion Branded Dragon. You can actually always use the Mercurial to negate that, and then in the end phase, assuming you had a Branded Dragon in grave, you, instead of setting Branded in Red, you can set Retribution instead, so that when your opponent's turn rolls around and you're trying to gimmick lock them again with the Sanctifier and they try to Bystial you, you can at least use this, like return that Sanctifier Dragon and then negate the summon of the Bystial, and then you can succeed in your gimmick lock. And because it's a counter trap, your opponent just will not be able to respond because well, Red Reboot is not available anymore. Now, another thing to remember about Quem is that if your opponent activates something like Pot of Prosperity or Pot of Extravagance where cards leave the extra deck, Quem will still trigger in those instances as well. It's not just when like a monster gets special summoned from the extra deck. So really keep that in mind, especially if you're going against Branded Despia, you might unwillingly trigger Quem and then they can kind of like go off as well. So be careful. Now, another quick tip in terms of, you know, I kind of alluded to this earlier in the very first example, but, you know, in terms of playing around Droll versus Imperm, I actually prioritize trying to play around Imperm, especially in game 1. Droll, of course, is very format dependent. If you watch like my YCS Top Cut breakdowns, it's actually kind of came back again as of the last Premier event. At the same time, Branded Despia for the most part can play through Droll pretty well. The only exception is if you have to start with like Foolish or Gold Sark into Strategy to get the Aluber, then yeah, sure. But otherwise, I would, if in a hand like this where you have access to Cartesia, I would still go into main phase first, use like the Fusion Deployment to get the Cartesia, and then use Opening and then to get the Aluber, because I think Imperm is just much more common that you have to play around. Now, a quick note about Branded in Red is that technically it can actually also return like a Despian extra deck monster, such as something like Lulu Lilith. But the thing is that if you return a card like an extra deck monster with Branded in Red, you actually will not be able to fuse, because the card does have to actually return to your hand to have the option of being able to fuse. So this really should not really come up. The only exception, I guess, is maybe you get Feather Duster and you had like no other targets. You might as well just like return, let's say, Lulu Lilith back to the extra deck. But just remember, you cannot fuse if you return an extra deck monster. Now, keeping with the example of Branded Red, remember that you don't actually have to fuse. Like, there might be some situations, rare situations in late game scenarios where you use Branded Red and you can just return something like a Luber in your grave back to your hand and just not fuse. You might not even have any monsters at this point if it's a mid game scenario, and you can always just, like, you know, summon it and then get access to Branded Fusion if that is a better line of play. So keep that in mind. You can even also return back something like Albaz to hand. Maybe it's better because, you know, you can like fuse away your opponent's monster and you somehow know your opponent already has an Ash or something anyway. So you know what, those are some examples available. Now, another example that I actually meant to say in the part 1 Branded Despia tip video is that for Guardian Chimera's effect to draw and pop, remember that it actually only has that effect if it's summoned off of a spell card, like fusion summon off of a spell card. So you can't just, like, let's say go Cartesia effect to summon like whatever monsters from your hand and field and go into Chimera. You will not be able to have that draw and pop effect if you go that route. Now, the final example, which again is also something that's probably not going to come up, but just keep in mind with Super Poly, neither player can respond to this card. So essentially what that means is, let's say you actually get Eradicator for like spells or something and you want to like just shotgun everything. Just keep in mind you're going to have to do Super Poly last if it's applicable even. Just because, let's say for example, you just start off with Super Poly, you know, discard like a card, and then you also wanted to play Branded Opening. You actually cannot respond to Super Poly either. So this has to come first, for example, and then just, you know, use Super Poly last if it's applicable. Alright guys, so that was it for the Branded Despia tips. Hopefully you found that helpful, but again, let's try to use this as a shared space so we can try to bounce back different ideas and try to find out any other possible tips that we can share to fellow Branded Despia players. So definitely thanks to all for watching the video. A huge thanks to my patrons as always for continued support, and well, take care guys.